Hi guys, it's Miss Kelley, and today we're going to be reading the last 3 chapters from From Alcatraz. I hope you're enjoying our story. I know I am. Alright, so let's review. So, the first 3 chapters, the first chapter was called Sound the Alarm, and it just kind of basically went over their actual escape the morning of that they found out that the 3 inmates, Frank Morris and the England brothers, were gone and not there anymore. And then we also learned that there was 2 other people that were involved. One was Alan West, and he was planning on attending. And then we had Clarence Carnes, who was the person that actually had a reputation for escaping from Alcatraz because he was involved in the Battle of Alcatraz. So the 3 men said no. They voted, or the 4 men voted and said, no, that's okay. So then Life on the Rock, it went back and told us background information on the actual 3 men. Actually, all of the men. Frank Morris, and it also brought in Bumpy and how he was the leader of the African Americans in Alcatraz. That he's still kind of, known kind of as a gang, and how he kind of made everyone in cell block C be quiet. And then again, chapter 3 was down the wrong path, and it told them what they did to get into prisons. But mainly Frank Morris and the England brothers were really not violent people. They just kept getting in trouble and having to go back to jail because they kept getting escaping and getting in trouble again. So anyways, then we had chapter 4 last week, which was tying up the details, and it told you how they actually decided to escape, and they were using the spoons to dig their cells out. They used the vents that were there on the floor vents, the grill vents, kind of like the to let the air in from the utility hallway. And then, they climbed up the ventilator shaft once they got out, and they actually stored a lot of stuff in the utility closet before they escaped. And then they did a lot of things up there to get prepared for the escape because they could, and it was hidden, and they would do that at night. And then they've built those dummies that look like them in the dark, of course, not really if they would have looked at them with light on, but in the dark, it looked like someone was really sleeping in the bed. So when the guards did the check at night, it looked like the men were in there because it was even real human hair. And, they got away with it that way. Now, they all had to have jobs also in the jail that allowed them to get those access to those things. And then chapter 5 was the logistics of the bay, and it had told you that there was 13 previous escape attempts. That was one of our questions on the Google form from last week. And it talked about how many attempts people had done before and how they had all failed to get off the rock. If they had gotten out, they failed to get actually off because the water there, it's very, very dangerous. Sorry, I have to cough here. I have terrible allergies. So now, then we had chapter 6, hiding in plain sight, and it talked about how they were able to get the blankets up there to cover up the work area, and they used some excuse that it was very dirty and the dust was going everywhere, and when he was painting, so he was able to get the blankets to cover, and that's how they built their raft and all their stuff because they needed more room. It was actually on top of the cells. They were 3 levels high, so up on top of that. And see, they didn't, they didn't really think anything of it, although they should have been. The guards should have been, because it was one of the main ways that they could have escaped. So now today we're going to be reading chapter 7, The Escape. At 7:30 p.m., the prisoners moved to the front of their cells to be counted. The guard walked past the cells, and when he finished his round, everyone was accounted for. Wes lay in his bed in the same way his dummy would look and waited. When the guard walked past, he moved slightly to show that he was real. Once the guard was safely past, Wes heard a soft scraping sound behind his wall. He knew what that meant. Frank Morris was crawling out of his cell door. Wes waited nervously. He wasn't to escape from his cell until the roof vent was open. Wes knew that once he opened his door, he would not be able to patch it up well enough to fool the guards. It was a door for a one-time use. If for some reason they ran into a problem and had to put off their escape, he did not want to be stuck with an obviously dug-out vent cover in his cell. Because his cell was a little bit different than the other men's. So that's why the other men could get out and go into the utility closet and work. But he couldn't. Wes couldn't. As for Morris, he deftly climbed the pipes just as he had done every night over the past few weeks. J.W. and Clarence joined him. Clarence carried a waterproof sack he had fashioned in which he stashed some important items, family photos and the names of people on the outside he could contact for help. The three men crept behind their tent of blankets above the cell block and boosted Morris into the vent shaft. Morris climbed up, filed through the bolts and on the wheel of the steel bars, and forced it up onto the top of the shaft. It clanged onto the roof, making a heavy metallic bang that everyone inside the cell house heard, including the guard on duty. Uh-oh. Officer A.V. Young called another officer in the control center to inquire about the sound. While he was on the phone, two more metallic clangs followed, very much like the first one. In the control center, Lieutenant Robert Weir turned on the paging system, which allowed him to listen via microphones to the entire cell house. He thought the sounds came from the hospital area and sent an officer to check it out. The officer found nothing out of place. In his cell, Alan West waited tensely to see if the guards would figure anything out about the noises. When it became clear that they had decided it was nothing, he relaxed a little. Then he heard his name. It was Morris behind his vent grill. It must have been music to West's ears. He may have smiled briefly before he got down and pushed with his feet against the grill. He expected it to come free fairly easily, but only one side popped out. He kicked again at the stuck side, but it held firm. He kicked again and again. It didn't move. West's heart beat hard. He felt the one thing that had kept him going all this time, the hope for freedom, flicker. He knelt to the vent for a closer look. There was a steel bar reinforcing the grill on the stuck side. What was it doing there? None of the others had come across a reinforcing bar. In a hard whisper, Morris asked what was taking so long. West explained about the bar and asked Morris to pull from his side. Working together, the men strained as hard as they could against the stubborn bar, but it was no use. It wasn't moving. West sized up the hole he made from the kicking out the other side. It was too small. He would never fit. After a few seconds of thought, Morris told West he would go get J.W. and Clarence and see what they could do. And then he disappeared from the corridor. West knew that Morris would not return. The four men had made an agreement that would not let one man put the whole mission in danger. If you couldn't do your part, you would be left behind. That was the deal that West had made. He had no one to blame but himself. Instead of sulking about his block vent, West got to work. He figured he could bend the bar back and forth several times to snap it. He worked until his hands were torn and bloody. To West's surprise, Clarence England did come to help him. He worked with West on the bar for a while, but they couldn't get it loose. He left West's dummy head in the corridor in case he got out. He could put it in place in his bed and catch up to the others. Then Clarence left him, just as Morris had. The trouble West had with his vent meant that had to alter their plan. They decided to leave West's life preserver and part of a boat. They had built 4 pontoons, 2 for each boat. They took apart one of the boats and left one pontoon for West in case he got out. They would fix the remaining boat so that it had 3 pontoons and can support all 3 men. Next, they grabbed their paddles they fashioned out of plywood and some thin lumber they had scrounged. They left an extra one for West. They shoved all their gear up the vent shaft above them and climbed up behind it. They scurried up the vent, pushing their gear ahead of them, and then they pushed everything out onto the roof and climbed out. They left the extra pontoon, life preserver, and paddle for West inside the air vent. And boys, and girls, let me just tell you that if you're doing, when you do the escape room this week that I have, that part sounds very much directional, doesn't it? Probably a letter from Bumpy to his wife you should be looking for. The men had been outside in the recreation yard, so simply breathing fresh air was not a new experience in itself. But breathing that air and feeling like free men, that was different. They filled their lungs with giant gulps of ocean air and ran across the roof toward the edge, where Morris had scooped out the kitchen stove vent pipes. Lights illuminated the wall, but they knew the closest guard shack was only occupied when the kitchen was receiving supplies. The road tower also had a clear view of the cell house wall and vent pipe, but it was not manned at night. Besides, there was no other way to go. They most likely tied their boat and other gear up in twine, which is rope, and lowered it down to the ground, and then they climbed down the pipe after it. Remember, they had to get all this stuff with them so they could, because now they have to cross an ocean. The dock tower loomed 500 feet away, and it periodically flashed a light. The men crawled slowly along the prison wall, keeping their faces turned away so their pale skin wouldn't be reflected in the light flashes. The men ran to a 10-foot fence and climbed over it. They clipped the barbed wire at the top with homemade wire clippers. There was no time to enjoy the feeling of soft earth beneath their feet. Pulling the gear behind them, they scrambled down through the brush to the beach. No alarm had sounded, and nobody had seen them on the roof or on the ground. Now they were out of sight of the gun tower. They were free of the prison. They knew their dummy heads would keep their escape secret until morning. At this point, they only had to worry about getting across the bay. A dense fog floated over the water as they waded out and climbed into the raft. People had argued for decades about what happened next. Did they take their raft all the way to San Francisco? Did they paddle to Angel Island? Or other inmates claimed was their plan, or did they signal a boat and get picked up? Alan West continued to work on that bar in the concrete. Finally, at around 1 a.m., he broke it. As quickly as he could, he squeezed through the hole, found the dummy head, and set it in his bed. Then he was back through the hole, up the pipes, and onto the cell block. He lifted himself into the vent shaft where he found the pontoon the others had left for him. He climbed up to the top, pushed the pontoon out, and climbed onto the roof. And there, lying on the roof, was his life preserver. But the other men had left him. He didn't trust that he could get off the island on his own. All of his work and planning had amounted to him standing alone on the roof of Alcatraz. And, boys and girls, what a bad feeling that should be for him, And really, of course they shouldn't be escaping from prison anyways, but that would be a terrible feeling getting left behind. Wes climbed back into the vent shaft, down to the top of the cell block, down the ladder of pipes, and into his cell. He put the dummy head back into the corridor and climbed into his bed. He was exhausted and defeated. That means he lost. Prisoners in nearby cells later reported that they heard him crying and complaining that the others had left him. And this next page shows the escapees left the vent grill on the roof for investigators to find. Boys and girls, if you're listening to me read it and you're not looking at the print copy, that's fine. But I highly suggest you going back and looking at the actual pictures that I've posted, because the book has some really cool pictures there that will explain this better to you. Chapter 8, Following the Clues. When the 7 a.m. wake-up bell, Clarence Carnes and Alan West were already wide awake. Both were nervous and exhausted, especially West, who had what was probably the most frustrating night of his life. Cell Block B stood for the 7:15 a.m. head count as usual. When it was discovered that Morris and the two England brothers were missing, the alarm went out quickly. Guards combed the island, including every possible hiding spot inside the buildings and every cave and stand of brush outside. Bloodhounds sniffed the beach and led investigators to a spot on the north shore. There, the scent went cold. What do you think that means, boys and girls? Yep, they got in the ocean. Soon Alcatraz staff realized that the blankets hanging above cell block B had been the key to the escape. It had been an outrageous mistake to provide such an obvious hiding spot for the escapees. I'm sure that officer got fired that allowed those blankets. When investigators went up there, they found the workshop that Morris, the Anglins, and West had established. A careful search of the roof turned up West's paddle as well as other tools and materials. Because remember, he had to just leave it there because he went back to his cell. Once it was established that the three men were almost certainly off the island, the search expanded rapidly. The national press ran stories about the escapees, which included photos of the three men, and tips poured in from all over the country. One headline read, "Out of Alcatraz by a spoon." Because remember, they used that spoon to dig. People said they saw the men in all sorts of places from Florida to Mexico. Of course, the news had also spread to the Anglin family in Ruskin, Florida. Clarence and J.W.'s mother, Rachel Anglin, had written a letter to Clarence on June 11th, the same day her sons escaped from prison. The letter contained news about a family wedding and an update on the local fishing. When she learned of the escape, she realized that Clarence had never received her letter, and she cried. She knew that she would probably never talk to her sons again. Federal investigators descended on the Anglin family home. They secretly recorded the telephone in case J.W. or Clarence called. They read the family's mail. They followed family members, including Rachel, wherever they went, hoping to find clues. They came to the door and demanded answers to questions. The family did not cooperate, and the FBI did not ease up on them. Two young boys, Ken and David Widener, were nephews of Clarence and J.W. They later said they could not go anywhere without the FBI following them. The federal agents harassed and intimidated them. Ken and David never forgot the constant pressure from the investigators, and they learned not to trust them. They would always hold a grudge against them. And the guys, they didn't know anything about it. As the two Widener boys got older, they continued to follow the case. They became obsessed with finding out what happened to their uncles. Alan West knew there was no way he could hide his role in the escape because, remember, his thing was now kicked out because he finally got it kicked out and he couldn't cover it up. He would be interrogated relentlessly, and he would likely spend a long, long time in segregation, which is he was alone from everyone else because he was in trouble, so he was in a cell by himself. While he waited on the roof that night and later in his cell, he considered his options. He would have to talk, but if he said too much, he would endanger his friends' chances of success. He would have to say just enough to satisfy the investigators, but not so much that it would lead them to finding his friends. When the escape was discovered, West stood upright away and showed the guards the door in the back of his cell. In fact, he claimed 100% credit for the escape plan. He said that it was he alone who had stolen all the raincoats, tools, and spoons. He had made the dummy heads. He had made the life jackets. And then West told the investigators this story. He said that the men planned to reach the mainland, steal a car and guns, break into a clothing store to get something to wear, and drive away and separate. None of West's story panned out. It was probably a lie meant to throw the search off track. Not to mention, we know that Morris and the Anglin brothers weren't violent, so they probably wouldn't have gotten guns anyways. All the cells on the cell block were searched. It turned out the two other prisoners had been chipping away at their vents, too. June Haywood Stevens and Woodrow Wilson Gainey had cells on the third level and had learned of the escape plan. They had wanted to join the men, but they weren't a part of their plan. When questioned, Gainey admitted that he and Stevens had been trying to escape with the others, but West found out and told them to stop digging. They were on the third floor, for one thing, and they would be crawling out of their vent holes into a 3-story drop-off with only pipes to grab onto. It was too difficult, and the risk of falling and getting discovered was too great. West also worried about them being discovered if chips of concrete fell the 3 floors down or the plumbers saw the work they were doing from the utility corridor. The men stopped when West asked them to and never resumed. See, These other men had ground floor cells. Gainey also told investigators that the escapees intended to steal a helicopter. Frank Morris had read a book about how to fly one. He said they planned to separate, then get together in the future and rob banks. None of this was true either. For days, helicopters hovered over the bay and up and down the coast. Patrol boats prowled through the water and pouring over beaches, cliffs, rocks, and piers. The FBI sent 8 cruisers to join the search. Divers searched underwater all around Alcatraz, but the 3 men did not turn up, dead or alive. 3 days after the escape, a homemade paddle was discovered near Angel Island. It was made from plywood and painted green, the same green as almost everything in Alcatraz. The paddle matched the one left behind for Alan West. The location of the discovery indicated that the men had headed for Angel Island. But had they made it? If so, how did they get off the island? Where'd they go next? The day after that, U.S. Army debris boats was moving between Alcatraz and Angel Island. These boats pick up trash and other junk floating in the water. As it passed between the 2 islands, it picked up Clarence England's waterproof bag containing photos and contact information. The bag was made of the same raincoat material as the life preserver and the pontoon left behind for West. Officially, the FBI determined that this bag was very important to the 3 men. There was no way they would have intentionally let it go, so they must have drowned. Eventually, all 3 of the life preservers were found. One was found near Alcatraz, one was found close to Angel Island, and one was found way out beyond the Golden Gate Bridge, nearly out to sea. It seemed likely that the jackets had deflated and the men had slipped under the icy water to drown, but their raft was never recovered, nor were their bodies. According to statistical records, 2 out of every 3 people who go missing in San Francisco Bay will eventually be found. The fact that none of their bodies were recovered does have statistical significance, which means they probably made it. But it doesn't rule out the idea that all 3 men drowned near the same place, their bodies drifting out to sea on the same current. Some investigators, and certainly many inmates and relatives of the Englands, believe that the men probably intentionally dropped the bag, hoping that the authorities would come to the conclusion that they had drowned. As the weeks and months went by, tips kept coming in, most of them providing no real leads. One was the postcard addressed to the warden and supposedly signed by the escapees. Another was a phone call made to a lawyer in San Francisco. The call claimed to be John England, and he said he would surrender if the lawyer would get him his day in court. The lawyer, Leslie McGowan, had done work for an Alcatraz inmate once years ago and gotten him freed. The man's name spread among other Alcatraz inmates after that, and he had represented several of the years J.W. may have gotten his name from someone inside. But investigators could not learn anything from the phone call, and the person never called again. A worker on a freight ship heading out past the Golden Gate reported seeing a body in the water around the same time the men escaped. He said it was floating face down and looked to be wearing what might be prison denims. But nobody else had seen the body, and he had not reported it until weeks later. One family reported that they saw a raft with 3 men in it out near San Pablo Bay, the northern end of the San Francisco Bay. They said that a speedboat had come by and possibly picked up the men from the raft and sped away. But when FBI checked it out, they found nothing. One tip pointed to the possibility that the men escaped successfully. It was illegal for any boat to be within 200 yards of Alcatraz Island on a regular basis. But police records show that there was a boat within a mile or 2 of the area on the night of the escape. A police officer reported seeing the boat sitting silently with its lights off around 1 a.m. After some time, the motor came on, the lights came on, and the boat drove under the Golden Gate Bridge out to sea. Deeper investigation revealed that the men had been studying Spanish during the months they were planning their escape. Some federal investigators believe their plan all along was to head to Mexico or South America, where they could blend into the daily life without being noticed. Tips continued to come in, but the men were never found, and soon the investigation dwindled. Excuse me. Chapter 9. The years tick by. In December 1962, 6 months after the escape, Rachel England received a Christmas card in the mail. It was signed with their son's name, John and Clarence. It must have filled her heart with joy to see those names and believe that they had escaped successfully. The following Christmas, another card arrived signed by John and Clarence. In 1964, for the third year in a row, a Christmas card arrived from the brothers. Not only that, but Rachel received flowers from an anonymous sender every Mother's Day until she died. Rachel and her family, including her grandsons Ken and David Widener, believed that John and Clarence were behind the Christmas cards and the flowers. They believed that J.W. and Clarence had lived. Miss Kelley does too. Hint, hint. Escape room. Rachel died in 1973, and the FBI attended her funeral in case J.W. or Clarence made an appearance. Nobody who looked like the two fugitives attended, but two unidentified women did show up. They were very tall and looked very strong. Remember, they're women. They wore long dresses and heavy makeup, and they didn't speak to anyone. Immediately after the service, they disappeared before anyone could talk to them, including the FBI agents. Many have suggested that this was Clarence and J.W. England come to pay respects to their mother. The FBI kept the investigation open for 15 years. They followed leads all over the world and kept tabs on the England family, but they never found the three men, and in 1979 they declared them officially dead and closed the case. I don't know why they did that, but anyways, they did. The U.S. Marshals reopened the case in 1993 when an inmate named Thomas Kent gave an interview to a TV show called America's Most Wanted. He said that Clarence England's girlfriend had agreed to meet them on shore and drive them to Mexico. Officials weren't convinced this was true. Even so, a spokesman for the U.S. Marshals said, "We think there is a possibility they are still alive." In 1989, a promising tip was sent to the U.S. Marshal by an anonymous woman identified only as Kathy. She had seen an episode about the Alcatraz escape on the TV show Unsolved Mysteries. On that episode, artist renderings were presented of what the men would likely look like at the time, almost 30 years since they had last been seen. Kathy called a tip line and said she had visited with a man living near the town of Marianna, Florida, who looked exactly like Clarence England. She said Frank Morris was with them. Authorities didn't know whether to believe her at first, but she provided details about the escape and correctly identified England's height, eye color, and other physical features not generally known to the public. Also intriguing was the fact that the England brothers had grown up in Georgia town just a few miles from Marianna and had family nearby. It seemed like a logical place for them to go. Kathy also said that she knew how the escape had succeeded. She said the members of the Ku Klux Klan had arranged to have a car waiting for the men in San Francisco. According to her story, the men had driven far away from the area by the time the authorities figured out they were missing in the morning. Then they split up, with Morris and Clarence England settling in Marianna. Kathy gave a location for the fugitives' home, and U.S. Marshal Mac McLean immediately set out to check the story. He spent weeks searching around the rural area surrounding Marianna, but he couldn't find any information about England or Morris. The tip, though it had seemed promising, was a bust. As for the England family, most believed that J.W. and Clarence made it out alive. In 1992, an old family friend, Fred Breezy, told the family that he had run into them in Brazil in 1975, and he had a photo to prove it. The photo shows two men standing next to a huge anthill. The men looked remarkably like J.W. and Clarence. For Ken and David, only boys when their uncles escaped. This confirmed what they had all hoped all along. The men had survived the escape. Brizzy was a drug smuggler who was doing business in Brazil at the time. He claimed he ran into John England at a bar and was taken back to his and Clarence's farm. He said that they had a lake on their land and showed him how to body surf holding onto a rope behind a boat. Breezy said that was how they escaped across the bay, by lassoing a boat transporting guards off the island. FBI records show that 120 feet of electrical cord had been stolen from the prison. Had they used it to rope the guard boat? If Breezy had this information that would be so important to the family, why did he wait so long to tell them? He said he believed if he gave the information or photo to the family sooner, the federal investigators would have found out. He was keeping the England brothers safe by sitting on his secret. In 1992, he felt it was finally okay to share it. Breezy died a year later, so thank goodness he did. Fred Breezy's wife of 20 years, Judith Breezy, cast doubt on his story. She had seen the photo in question, but Fred never mentioned who was in it. She had divorced Fred and reminded investigators that he was a criminal and therefore not trustworthy. Ken and David Widener, who had grown up in the shadow of the mystery, offered to share the photo with investigators many years later, in 2015, in exchange for a favor. The favor had to do with another England brother, their uncle Alfred. Alfred England had stayed in prison his whole sentence without trying to escape, and by 1964 he was finally up for parole. When family members visited him in prison, he was excited about getting out. He also revealed that he had heard from Clarence and J.W. and planned to visit them when he got out. A few days later, Alfred tried to escape and was electrocuted on a security fence and died. The England family smelled something fishy. Why would Alfred try to escape after all this time, when his parole was right around the corner? It didn't make any sense. They didn't believe he had tried to escape. Rather, prison officials had heard him talking about Clarence and J.W., and they tried to get him to tell what he knew, and when he wouldn't talk, they beat him to death. Then they threw his body on the electric fence and made it look like he had a failed escape attempt. Ken and David Widener called up Art Roderick, the U.S. Marshal investigator who had managed to gain their trust. "We feel like we found the right person we can trust in Art and felt comfortable enough to share it," Ken Widener said. Roderick met Ken and David in Ruskin, Florida. The Widener men showed Roderick the Christmas cards the family had received, but these didn't interest Roderick much. They could very easily be fakes. Then they showed him Brazzy's photo. That got Roderick's attention. Roderick had investigated the case for decades. He was eager to get it solved, so he asked the brothers if he could take the photo and have it analyzed. But Ken and David would not give up the photo, not without a favor. They wanted to have Alfred England's body exhumed from its grave and examined. Did it have signs of physical trauma, as if he'd been beaten? Roderick wanted the photo, so he agreed to the deal. Alfred's body was pulled from the ground and examined. It did not show any signs of physical abuse. While they had the body, they took the opportunity to solve another mystery. Back in 1962, around the night of the men escape, a body had been recovered from the bay. Some had speculated that it might have been one of the escapees, but there was no proof. Investigators ran DNA testing on the body from the bay and on the body of Alfred England to see if there was a match, but the drowning victim did not have any England DNA. They also tested a member of Frank Morris's family. There was no match there either. The dead man found in the sea was not Clarence or John England or Frank Morris. Meanwhile, Roderick had the photo from Fred Breezy tested. A forensic artist found 8 different points on each face that matched the brothers' mugshots. He declared that the photo was highly likely to be the England brothers. Still, Roderick was not convinced. "It's a lead," he said, "but I would like some more pieces of evidence." He added, "I'm still holding to my original opinion that until we have 100% confirmation they survived, that it's most likely the brothers drowned in the San Francisco Bay. Forensic artists are not like DNA or fingerprints. It's not an exact science." Nevertheless, the photograph gave Roderick hope. Though he is retired, the hopes drive him to continue investigating on his own until he solves the case. Just as hope drove the prisoners on the rock, Ken and David and the rest of the Englands also feel driven by the hope that J.W. and Clarence defied the odds and survived their escape. I kind of think it's cool too. I hope they did as well. "This is absolutely the best actionable lead we've had," Roderick said of the photo. "I truly believe we're going to close the case. Until then, the mystery lives on." Now, there's one little last part, the epilogue. Remember, that's a text feature in a book, especially nonfiction, and it gives you a little bit more information. Months after the escape, the U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy announced that the prison at Alcatraz would be closed. In a way, this was a big part of the legacy of the escape. For men such as Clarence Carnes, breaking the rock, even by someone else, was a way to get off of it. Life in Alcatraz was miserable, and the thought that one day he could get out of there was the only thing that kept Carnes and other inmates going. That hope. So where did they end up? Alan West cooperated in the investigation into the escape. He was interviewed once by Alcatraz officials and twice by federal investigators. In return, he was not charged for participating in the escape. He was transferred several times to other prisons and finally released in 1967, after which he was arrested for grand larceny. He was serving a life sentence in Florida State Prison when he died of an abdominal disease on December 21st, 1978 at 49 years old. Now listen, he was out of prison and he could have just been good and not done that, and then he wouldn't have had to have gone back to prison and died. Clarence Carnes, who was serving a life sentence on top of a 203-year sentence, was nevertheless paroled in 1973 at the age of 46. That means he got out as well. But he violated his parole and went back to prison. Of course he did. Where he died of complications related to a disease in 1988. Bumpy Johnson was released in 1963 and returned to Harlem, New York, where he was a powerful and popular gangster. He died of a heart attack in 1968 at the age of 62. U.S. Marshal Art Roderick is retired but continues to investigate the escape of Alcatraz. He is hopeful that the case will be solved in his lifetime. Ken and David Widener live in Florida, and they continue to wait. If their uncles survived, they would be in their mid-80s now. Starting in October 1973, Alcatraz became a tourist attraction. Each year, more than 1.3 million people ride the ferry across the bay that Morris and the England set out to cross so long ago. Visitors can tour the islands and buildings, including the cell house. Former convicts and guards narrate the recorded tours. Rangers and other volunteers lead the guided tours. And again, boys and girls, there's some really neat pictures in this book. So I hope you go and you look at the print version so that you can see the book, all the pictures and the pages and the people, because they're all real pictures, and it really helps you understand a little bit better this story. I hope you enjoyed it, boys and girls. I sure do miss you. I know this is our last week of school, and I'm super sad about it, but I get to see you this Friday, the 22nd, so I am a little happy about that, even though we have to stay separate and y'all have to stay in the car. But no, I love y'all, and I was happy to have y'all in my class this year, and I think y'all are wonderful kids, and you're going to do awesome in middle school. Bye, guys.